Welcome to another of the Why Study series of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. With me today is Dr. Karen Kilby, who's one of the leading authorities in the English-speaking world on a German theologian, Karl Rahner. Karen, why study Karl Rahner?
Okay, well, I think you should study Karl Rahner because I think he's simply one of the most fascinating figures of the 20th century, or really of the whole modern period in theology. And I think the reason he's so fascinating is an unusual combination he has of a really intelligent speculative mind with a very strong pastoral sense. I think people often miss the pastoral sense in Rahner. And then thirdly, with a deep rooting in a tradition of Ignatian spirituality. And I think those three things coming together make him a really interesting theologian and a really kind of valuable, important, significant theologian. There are some impediments to reading him. There are some things that make him difficult, so you have to get past the impediments. But that would be my short answer, because of this combination of sheer intellectual power, a pastoral orientation, and that kind of spiritual rootedness of Rahner.
Can you give us an example of how you think he had intellectual power and some of his big ideas?
I mean, in a way, people sometimes look for, the leading idea of Rahner, and they might say it's his notion of the Vorgriff which is the preapprehension of being, or they might say it's his understanding of grace. And there are some very powerful ideas, but in a way, what I find most fascinating about Rahner is the way he can turn his mind to almost any topic, so the sort of sheer variety of the way his mind works. And you find Rahner writing about, of course, about Christ and about the church and about Mary, but also you'll find essays on the theology of power, the theology of leisure, the theology of childhood, the theology of angels. Anything under the sun, Rahner will have something to say about. And he will combine in an interesting way a real knowledge of the tradition and some of its sort of fascinating details with a real concern for how a modern person thinks, what can make sense to us today.
I remember being told as a student that his brother, Hugo Rahner, once said that his task would be to translate his brother into German. Now, you used a phrase there, the preapprehension of being.
Uh-huh.
Now, 30 seconds. What does the preapprehension of being? What does that? That's one of the problems I find with Rahner. I've been reading Rahner since I was 17 years old. You sometimes meet a lovely technical phrase. Now, preapprehension of being.
Before I answer that, can I tell you why I think there's technical difficulties to Rahner? Because I think that's there's an interesting historical answer to that. Because on the one hand, Rahner was a student of Heidegger. He sat in Heidegger's seminar. Heidegger wasn't his supervisor. He didn't become a Heideggerian, but he was somewhat influenced. He certainly picked up Heideggerian language. So the preapprehension of being, the German is Vorgriff. So that's a word for preapprehension. That's a word that Rahner will have taken from Heidegger. And on the other hand, Rahner was very steeped in the neo-scholasticism of the period of his education, which was a very technical, dry, complex system that everyone had to learn. And he presumed that his audience knew it. So it's the preapprehension of being, the word being there. He's using the Latin for being that would be used in the way that would be understood by his neo-scholastic counterparts. So you get the interaction of these two different kinds of jargon into one person that can make it quite a headache. So that's my preamble to my answer. But what is the preapprehension of being? Rahner thinks that in every act of knowing or willing, we have this kind of prior awareness, or this co-awareness of the infinity of being and of God, so that we're incapable of knowing that this is a chair I'm sitting on, this is a person I'm talking to, without at the same time our minds reaching out to infinity. So while we're aware of particular objects, we always also have a kind of background awareness, or awareness of a horizon against which the particular finite object sits, and this is the infinity of being and of God. So God is not something we come across from time to time, according to Rahner, but is like the water in which the fish swim, the air in which we move, kind of. We're always reaching out, moving towards having a sense of God.
So we can never sort of be outside of being. We can never be looking in on the universe. We're always somehow in the play that we're observing.
That's true. And we can never look at God as one thing in the universe, write a list of everything on the universe and God's going to be, the final one or the first one or somewhere in the middle. So we can never know God in the way that we know other things, but always in knowing, we never could know anything, Rahner thinks, if our mind wasn't always oriented towards a knowledge of God. It takes a little getting used to. It's quite a strong claim, and so this is why some people think it's central, and it is fairly central, but I wouldn't get too hung up on it. As Rahner's only claim.
What other major contributions would you see that he's made to the toolbox of theologians?
Well, I'll tell you about a couple that I particularly like.
Okay.
I should probably start by what he's best known for. People who don't know anything else about Rahner will have come across his notion of anonymous Christians, the idea that some kind of implicit anonymous faith in Christ is possible and may account for the possibility of salvation for those outside the church in the ordinary sense of the word. He's widely known for this. He's quite widely criticized for it, but it's usually read out of context. So I thought I should just mention that because that's the thing he's most known for. And actually in connection with that, that idea originally came up in a pastoral context. It all arises from his question of, what do you do for a 55-year-old lady in the pews who's very worried about her son who seems to have lost his faith? And do you have to tell her he's going to hell? And because of that kind of pastoral question, he comes up with, well, we need to think about how much we don't know. We don't know what's going on in the depths of her son's heart. We don't know what accepting Christ means, and we can develop the possibility of an anonymous Christianity. But something I really like in Rahner is an essay he wrote in his Theological Investigations, Volume 4, on the concept of mystery in Catholic theology. And he's the only person I know who's written a really interesting essay simply on the concept of mystery and on the fact that we should not think of theology as again, these neo-scholastics did, as presenting a whole series of separate mysteries, each one a little square box with something we can't quite understand in this life. But it must not be a list of different things we must believe. There must be some kind of unity. So there must be a single mystery. And this mystery must be both unknowable to us, but intimate to us. So somehow he completely reconfigures the idea of mystery in a really interesting way and says ultimately God is the absolute mystery and all of theology revolves around mystery. And this means that to be successful in theology, you wind up knowing less. You wind up becoming more and more clear on how unknowable things are, rather than coming closer and closer to actually nailing everything down. I think that's a very nice orientation for theology.
When Rahner engages with mystery, for a lot of us, the word mystery just means something that's a riddle. And for theologians, it often just means, I've got to the end of my tether, and I'll now call it mystery. Can you just say a little bit more about what mystery means?
So Rahner wants to say mystery is what is so close to us that we can't see it, or what is so intimate to us too much. It's closer to saying that a person remains a mystery to me. I can't say, I've known my husband for 26 years, or whatever it is, and so now I know him completely. It seems somehow a bit more right to say, well, I know a lot of things about him, but as a person, he remains somewhat mysterious to me. And in that way, persons share in the inner intrinsic mystery of God. So mystery is not something that can, with a bit more information, can be solved, but is something that is sort of beyond pinning down, beyond what we might comprehend simply.
Does that mean that theology always has to cope with its unknowing and dark side?
It does, absolutely. And so you must be very nervous of a theologian who thinks that they're going to take you from not knowing very much to knowing quite a lot more. It's never really what Rahner wants to do.
You mentioned the Theological Investigations. When I last looked in the library, they were up to volume 21 in English. Have they moved beyond that now?
23 is the final
23.
volume.
Okay. So we know that he was one of the most productive theologians of the 20th century. What would you begin with if you're going to someone says, I want to read something by Rahner? What's a place to start?
Well, I think a really good place to start is not with any of his proper theology, but with a book of published prayers that he wrote. I mean, these are probably not prayers that he simply said by his bedside, but he wrote prayers in the genre that Augustine might have written prayers. So there's a book called Encounters with Silence. It's very short, it's very readable, it's quite moving, and it gives you a real insight into Rahner's orientation. If you like him from there, then probably leap straight into volume 4 of the Theological Investigations.
Okay, and one last question. You want to read about Rahner. I know you've written something. Would you like to tell us?
Okay, well, you made it very clear I had to bring my books along, and I've written
product placement.
I've written an introductory book on Rahner, but unfortunately my English copy I left at home. But I'll show you 2 copies in Spanish and Indonesian here. But there is an English copy called SPCK, Introduction to Karl Rahner. Is a very readable, you can read it early in the morning or late at night, easy book that's not a bad introduction.
You gave me a copy, and I can tell you that's true.
Now, if you get into reading Rahner and start to get confused by him and get a little further along, then you might just want to read this other book I wrote called Karl Rahner, Theology and Philosophy, where I look into this question of what does this pre-apprehension of being mean, and various issues about grace and about the relation of philosophy and theology in his thought. So that's another possibility.
Well, thank you very much. So, we've been looking at just one 20th century major theologian, and I hope that this has given us a little insight into Karl Rahner, the man, and his theology. Thanks, Karen.